Today, we're diving into one of the most influential texts on the planet, the Old Testament. But we're not just going to read it. We are going to launch a kind of literary investigation, looking at it the way a scholar does, as a complex, layered document with a fascinating story to tell about how it even came to be.
All right, so let's just jump right in with what seems like a simple question, but it's really the key to the whole thing. Is the Old Testament actually a single book?
The short answer? Nope, not even close. You see, the texts that make up the Old Testament weren't written by one person in one lifetime. They were written, edited, and collected over a mind-boggling period of more than 1,000 years. Think about that. A millennium of different authors in different places, all contributing to this collection.
And that's why this is the single most important idea to grasp. It's so much better to think of the Old Testament not as a book, but as a library. It's an entire anthology of ancient Israel's literature, and it has everything: history, law, poetry, even fiction and prophecy. It's a whole collection on one shelf.
And what's really wild is that not every library has the same table of contents. Different religious traditions, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, have their own official lists of books. These lists are called canons. They even arrange the books in a different order to tell a slightly different big-picture story. It just goes to show you that the contents of this library were decided and debated over a very long time.
Okay, so if we accept that it's a library built over centuries, that unlocks a central mystery that bugged scholars for ages. They started noticing, well, weird things, inconsistencies. For instance, why are there two completely different creation stories right at the beginning? Why do different sections use different names for God? And why does the story of Noah and the flood sometimes feel like it's repeating itself with slightly different details?
Well, to solve this puzzle, scholars basically had to become literary detectives, and the leading theory they came up with is called the documentary hypothesis. The big idea is that the first 5 books of the Bible, what's known as the Torah or the Pentateuch, aren't one single narrative. Instead, they were skillfully woven together from at least 4 distinct, much older documents.
So let's meet these hidden authors. Scholars gave them nicknames: J, E, D, and P. The J source, or Yahwist, calls God by the personal name Yahweh right from the start, and describes God in very human-like ways, like walking in the Garden of Eden. The E source, or Elohist, prefers the more general term Elohim for God. D is the Deuteronomist, whose voice is mostly heard in, you guessed it, the Book of Deuteronomy. And finally, there's P, the priestly source, who is all about order, rituals, and family trees. These 4 distinct voices were eventually combined into one story.
So, what was the big clue that tipped them off? One of the main ones was the different names used for God. In that J source, God's personal name, Yahweh, is used from the very beginning of the story. But in the E and P sources, that name isn't revealed until much later, in the time of Moses. So you have these 2 totally contradictory traditions about God's name, and instead of choosing one, the final editors kept them both, right there in the text, side by side.
And this is where it gets really cool, because you can actually see the seams where these sources were stitched together. Take the flood story. See that super precise dating in the middle? In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month on the 17th day. That is classic priestly source, P, obsessed with order and specifics. Now look at the story around it. Noah went into the ark, and the Lord shut him in. That's the J source's storytelling style. You are literally reading 2 different flood accounts woven into one. And that's why it feels repetitive, because it is.
Okay, so we've been looking for clues inside the text. But what happens when we step outside this library and look at the wider historical record? When you compare the biblical stories to archaeology and other ancient writings, a really clear pattern emerges. For the earliest figures, like Abraham or Moses, there's just no direct external evidence. But as we move forward in time, external proof for biblical people and events starts to show up, and it gets stronger and stronger.
For example, check this out. This is the Mesha Stela, a stone monument from around 840 BCE. It confirms that an Israelite king named Omri, who's in the Bible, actually existed. But, and this is a big but, it tells the story from the enemy's point of view. The Moabite king brags about how his god, Chemosh, helped him defeat Israel. It's just a powerful reminder that the Bible is one perspective in a much larger, more complicated ancient world.
So how do we handle those earliest stories, the ones like creation, that don't have historical proof? Well, the key is understanding the word myth. Now, in modern scholarship, myth absolutely does not mean false or a lie. It's a term for the powerful foundational stories that ancient people told to explain deep cosmic truths about where the world came from, what the gods are like,
and what our place is in all of it.
You see, the biblical writers didn't live in a vacuum. They were surrounded by these myths. A really common one across the ancient Near East was the combat myth, where a hero god battles a giant sea dragon representing chaos and creates an orderly world from its body. The biblical writers knew this story, and they used that exact same imagery, Yahweh crushing the heads of the sea dragon Leviathan, to make a powerful statement about their God. They weren't just copying, they were taking a well-known theme and retooling it to express their own unique beliefs.
This idea of honoring different traditions is so strong you can even see it in the Ten Commandments. The Bible actually gives us two different versions. In Exodus, the reason to rest on the Sabbath is to imitate God, who rested on the seventh day of creation. But in Deuteronomy, the reason is all about social justice. You should rest because you remember being slaves in Egypt, and so you have to let your own slaves and workers rest too. The final editors thought both reasons were important, so they just kept both.
So what's the big takeaway from our investigation? Well, it's that the Old Testament isn't some flat, single-author book that's full of historical mistakes. No, it's a multi-layered masterpiece. It's the living, breathing, literary record of a people wrestling with their identity, their history, and their understanding of God for over 1,000 years.
So why does this matter? Because it completely changes how we read these texts. Suddenly, those two names for God, or the two reasons for the Sabbath, stop being problems you have to explain away. Instead, they become incredible windows into the deep conversations ancient Israel was having about God and justice. We get to see the text not as a static photograph, but as a dynamic, evolving collection of traditions that gave it such amazing and enduring power.
You know, seeing the Old Testament this way, as a library full of layered texts, doesn't diminish it at all. If anything, it makes it infinitely richer and more interesting. And it leaves us with this one final compelling question. What other layers of meaning, what other ancient conversations are just sitting there waiting to be discovered in the stories we thought we knew so well?